Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to the Sweetwater Minute. Very special guest is with us in the studio today. This is Todd Rundgren. Great to see you.
Great to be here.
Glad to have you here.
Thank you so much.
You're on your way from Columbus up toward Michigan playing gigs, right?
Yeah, we're just starting out another leg of our 2018 touring. This will go for a little less than a month, actually, not very long. We got some other events to do. I'm doing a David Bowie tribute that's going to Iceland after that, and then we have some fan events in California and Australia. And we wrap it up just around Thanksgiving weekend.
So the tour, you're calling it the Unpredictable Tour.
Yeah.
What can someone expect from an unpredictable tour?
Well, you should not expect anything from an unpredictable tour, but essentially we have a list of about 70 songs that include some of my songs, but a bunch of other mostly obscure material or material that product of a one-hit wonder that's no longer playing, that sort of thing. And I tell the band which song we're going to start with, and after that I just start pulling them out of the air.
All right, so it's just purely off the top of the head.
Yeah, so no two shows are alike, or they're not intended to be alike. If they are alike, it's a complete accident. So.
Right. So how difficult is it to shift from doing that to then doing the Bowie tribute? You just did, or you're just about to do the Night of Harmony as well?
We did that. That was this past weekend. We started out this leg first with a visit to Notre Dame, where we worked with some student musicians and put on a little show with them. Then the next night, Saturday, we played with the Chicago Sinfonietta at the House of Blues, and that was all for the benefit of the foundation that we started called Spirit of Harmony, which is essentially an advocacy organization to encourage school systems to put music in, make it a part of the regular curriculum, and especially at the early grades, because it has an effect on the way you process sound. And if you get some music education early on, you get the benefits of that for the rest of your life, even if you don't go on to be a musician. So we think that it's, there's a moral imperative there in that it is an actual help to kids in their overall education. Right.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah. So it interests me. I think you're one of the most diverse artists we've ever interviewed here, but what I find particularly intriguing about that is, as opposed to artists who do this and go in different directions, you tend to add parallel paths and incorporate them into what you're doing. Just as an example, coming from being a musician to then adding engineering, then adding producing, and you're doing more collaborative things here. Tell us a little bit about that, how you expand your scope as a creative artist.
Well, when I first started out, I was just a guitar player, and I would have been happy just to be a guitar player. My expectations weren't that grand. And when that band that I was in, that blues band, decided to go another direction and become more of a West Coast psychedelic band, I decided that I wanted to start a band of my own, and it would be more of a hybrid of English style bands like the Yardbirds and the Who, and kind of really tight harmonies like the Beatles and the Beach Boys, that sort of thing. So expanded my performance into singing, and then after about 18 months the band broke up because of interpersonal conflicts, and at that point I became an engineer and a producer, just as a way to make a living. And I became very successful at that, and my own career became something of a sideline. And the advantage of having that day job of the production thing was that I didn't have to fret about the success of my own music in the way that most artists did, because I already was making a living. So all my records became vanity projects, and I had the freedom to do things like take the money that I made from something like Bat Out of Hell and build my own video studio. So we got into video pretty early on, just because I had the wherewithal to do it. Also around that time started learning about computers and what was possible by applying computer technology to music. And eventually, as we all know, computers replaced the standard listening devices,
right.
and now everyone listens on digital devices and downloads the music that they hear. So being educated about the possibilities gave me a little bit of advance notice about what was going to happen in the future, and that allowed me to position myself accordingly.
Right, right. From the outside, it looked like you made these immediate jumps from you're an artist and then you're engineering records with Robbie Robertson and the band, and there had to be a time there when you were spending effort to learn the craft of engineering and then later get into production, or did you just step right in and start placing microphones and record?
Well, it was pretty much hands-on for me. The Nas, the band that I put together, we did 2 records. We did 2 recording sessions. Our first album, we had a producer, his name was Bill Trout, and he was like an old-fashioned style producer. You would sit there and read the trades and just make sure the sessions didn't go overly long.
Right.
So I decided that when we did our second record, I would produce it myself. And we did it in a small independent studio, so I was allowed to put my hands on the board. And I essentially learned how to engineer by mixing that project.
Okay.
By, essentially using my ears and turning the knobs until everything sounded right to me. And apparently did that effectively enough that I got hired by the Albert Grossman organization after the band broke up, principally as an engineer and eventually as a producer.
Right, right. And then you made the connection and did the Robbie Robertson, he was producing, correct?
Did the Stage Fright album with the band. That was my first major project. And then after that, they started trusting me with the production on things like Ian and Sylvia and James Cotton and some of the other artists that were on the stable. And as I got a little bit more reputable with the work, started branching out. I was doing Badfinger, for Apple Records, and eventually Meatloaf, New York Dolls, into the 80s XTC. By the time we got to the 90s, things had changed to the point that the production business started falling off. And realizing that record sales were going to be entering this sort of unmanageable phase, just started performing live more. And so now I'm out at least 6 months a year, sometimes as much as 10 months a year, depending on who else I might be working with.
Right, right. Along the way, you've obviously done a lot of different projects, both as a producer and as an artist yourself. As a producer, looking at your own work versus somebody else's work, how do you approach those differently?
Well, if someone needs my help as a producer, they're obviously reached some sort of a turning point or decision-making point in their musical career. I sort of specialized in new bands who had never been in the studio before, and also bands who had reached a point where they wanted a change of some kind. For instance, Grand Funk Railroad had developed a reputation as a jam band, and they wanted to be more kind of accessible, more top 40, I guess, and I helped them do that. So my reputation mostly was as a troubleshooter, not necessarily as just a standard guy that you would go to have a formula hit record.
Right.
So in that capacity, that's why I was hired to do Badfinger after a year of them trying to make a record with 2 other producers. I came in, we finished it in 10 days. So it was my efficacy in some ways that was part of my reputation. I was able also to make, being a songwriter, I could make concrete contributions to the material as well. Like if the band would get hung up and not be able to come up with a verse to finish a song off, I might be able to help them with that.
Right.
Especially with a band like the Tubes, I was, during the Remote Control album, I was kind of like co-writer, but I didn't want I didn't want the writer's credit because it looked like too much of a Svengali production. You know, I still wanted the focus to be on the band. So I essentially would do whatever was necessary, a lot or a little, depending on what the band needed to get through the project.
Right, right. You mentioned a couple of things there. One being formula. Somewhere around the Something Anything album and then moving into A Wizard, a True Star, you've talked about how you wanted to jettison formulaic songwriting, and then during A Wizard and True Star, you built your own studio. Tell us a little about that era and what was leading you in that direction, away from formulaic things to a more freeform approach.
After my third album, which was called Something Anything, I had developed a style of songwriting that was based on certain kind of chords and certain sort of forms, that most of which were traditional. And probably more bothersome to me was the fact that I was writing about this one relationship I had in high school that, you know, went bad, and that was fueling all of the lyrics that I was writing. So when I finished the album, I was listening to it and I said this was at some points just too easy to make, because I wrote the first hit single off of it was I Saw the Light, and I wrote it in like 20 minutes. And so I thought, this isn't really reflective of kind of the broader range of influences that I have. So I decided that I would take a radically different approach on the next record, that I would try not to think in traditional song forms, that I would allow the possibility that songs could be fragmentary and, you know, anecdotal, as opposed to, you know, all filled out with a verse, chorus, blah, blah, blah. It could just be a verse and end. And so, and there were found sounds and all other kinds of things, genre hopping and mashups of various things. So that essentially set the bar at a different place for me. I was now operating in full consciousness of the freedom that I had created for myself. And so all the records after that would essentially be different than the preceding ones. Sometimes they might be radical and progressive, sometimes might be very concise and song-oriented. Usually it had something to do with whether I was playing the instruments or not. If I was playing all the instruments, then the songwriting was simpler because of my limitations with some of the instruments I was playing. And if I had access to other musicians, it might get more complex.
Right, right. Kind of the culmination of that freeform approach is when you got into the CDI, the interactive approach to things, where you were doing a lot of short snippets, and there was all kinds of material there that the listener could then work with.
Yeah, I got it into my head that, you know, the way that you experience music could also undergo a technological update. And that because of that, you would be able to give the listener more choices than they normally had. So I got into my head this idea of music that was recorded specifically to be recontextualized. So I did an album called No World Order, and it was eventually broken down for the CDI project into about 1,000 or so 2 to 4 bar musical pieces that could be pasted together in almost any order. And then we used the CDI itself as a navigating device so that you could, let's say, listen to a song with the vocals taken out, or listen to a song with some of the instruments taken out so you could hear the vocals more, or determine the tempos that you wanted so that the music could be repurposed for a particular activity. Like if you wanted to do aerobics, you want the music to always be at a certain tempo level, you know. Whereas if you're like serving dinner or making out or something like that, you want the music to have a different quality. And philosophically, it seemed like a no-brainer to the point that I was asked to port that system or to redesign it for an interactive television experiment that was going on in Orlando, Florida. And so we redesigned the system, but the problem was, in order to even find out in this test community what the demand would be for interactive music services, that meant that you had to put music on servers, and it had to be music that people would be interested in downloading on their interactive TV box. So we went to the 5 major labels at the time, and not a single one of them would consider the possibility of putting their music on a server. This was about 1993. Mm-hmm. A year or so later, this thing called Napster appeared, and it was the beginning of the end of what essentially was the commoditized model of music. Mm-hmm. Now music is essentially looked at more as a service by the people who use it, which I always thought was a more practical solution anyway, because buying the single, the one piece of plastic that essentially represented a music purchase in the old days, it involved a whole, kind of series of, how do you split up the, the costs of something that is manufactured.
Right.
And now that there's none of, you can still get an LP, and stuff like that, but hardly anybody makes 45s anymore and that sort of thing. So in this brave new world, you're not selling things anymore. You're selling access to things, access to the music. Music is one of those things that doesn't mean anything unless it's actually vibrating the air and you can hear it. Mm-hmm. So your wall of LPs is very impressive, but it doesn't matter if they're all scratched up and marred and, destroy the experience of listening to the music. So now that everything has changed to that other sort of model, everyone has to reposition themselves. And as I mentioned, I reposition myself as more of a performing artist as opposed to someone who would spend most of his time in the studio.
Right.
That means I have less time to make music, but also technological advances have made it possible to do things outside the studio that formerly didn't seem practical. Mm-hmm. Right. My whole system now is in my laptop.
Right, it's amazing.
So all I need is an audio interface and a microphone and my laptop and headphones, and I'm ready to record.
Right, this is awesome. It seems like, looking at that progression in your career with the CDI, and you mentioned video earlier, and a variety of websites and things you've done, and PatronNet, and the visuals you do in your live concert and the sets and things, that it seems to me that you've been looking for or seeking, as part of your creative process, a way to bring the audience more into it than just the audio experience.
I think I sort of felt that way going back to even before I got into video. I always thought there were, possibilities of creating another component to the music that makes everything more effective, or more kind of give it all more impact, that right. You feel it at more levels. So the idea of, musical theater is like that. You take music and you add acting to it, and you've got musical theater or opera or something like that. So combining these forms, it'd be really silly, not necessarily always, you can conceptually get away with it, but if you can imagine dance with no music,
right,
it would be just a little strange seeing a bunch of people just leaping around,
right,
but
right.
There's no emphasis, in terms of, what's going on emotionally or that sort of thing. So the whole idea of expanding the sensory range, that, and music being a part of it, has always been there for me. I was always into musical theater. Then as time went on, we got much more fantastic and flexible with the kinds of things you could do on stage.
Right.
Culminating now with the, some of our recent tours, we have full stage size video walls and and lights that are cool to the touch, you know,
Right,
unlike
right.
you know the old days when, you know, if you wanted a lot of light on stage, you were essentially baking the performers in the process. So we can create some pretty spectacular tableaus now, and they don't, you know, they don't cost us what they used to in terms of, you know, the effect on other aspects of the performance.
Right, right, right. So I came across a number of quotes from you that I'd love to bounce off you. And the first one of those is that music is the most plagiaristic art.
Yes.
And you've been pretty open about, for example, Hello, It's Me being based on the chord progression from a Jimmy Smith organ song and things, and other
Right.
songs as well. You've mentioned that. Talk a little bit about what you meant by that.
Well, we have a very limited palette to start with. You know, we've got essentially, you know, the 12-tone scale. And for any particular audience, depending on sort of the mode that you're working in and, you know, culturally what people are used to listening to, you can only use so many of those notes, and you can only use them in certain sequences and that sort of thing. So it's inevitable just by the math alone that eventually you're going to write something that was written before.
Right.
So the most creative aspect about music is hiding that.
Right.
Figuring out a way to hide the fact that you likely have already written, that you've written something that's already been written. You know, and my, you know, greatest horror is that I would rewrite something I've already written.
Right, right.
So yeah, the whole idea is, you know, you change it, you move things from one, could be the same melody, but you move it to a different genre and change the chording behind it, and it becomes less recognizable. And lyrics do a lot to distract from the self-similarity of a lot of music. So as long as you've got a different subject or different hook line or whatever, then you can obscure the fact that that it's really difficult to be original with music because of the limited palette that we're working with.
Right, right. You also have said that, actually on your TRI.com site has a number. I could have spent the whole time talking to you about the quotes that are on that site, but two that jumped out at me were, one was, I'm not a fan of rock and roll.
Well, because people have gotten, I don't know when it happened, but they decided that all pop music would suddenly be called rock and roll.
Right.
You know, and if the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was really just about rock and roll, it would be done inducting new members, you know, because almost nobody, after Elvis left the Army, almost nobody played rock and roll. You could say Elvis going into the Army essentially was the end of it. That was the end of rock and roll. Then, even though the Beatles, you know, just let me hear some of that rock and roll music, you know, they would use the term with some liberalness. But in the end, you know, they started inventing and discarding genres that had nothing to do with rock and roll.
Right.
Classic rock, whatever it is, Eleanor Rigby, nobody had really done anything like that before, and they did that, and then they moved on to something else, psychedelic rock or something like that, another genre that nobody knew. Well, it didn't really exist until the Beatles started taking drugs.
Right.
Music never really did go back to that whole thing of like, you know, that sort of simplicity, the 12-bar blues-based, youthful themes, you know, about school and going to the hop and that sort of stuff, you know, that at a certain point, you know, is just kind of becomes naive once you get older. You know, once, I mean, the Beatles, by the time they broke big, they were all in their 20s.
Right.
But they were still saying, I want to hold your hand, and all sorts of cute and lovable stuff, and, you know, pretending that John wasn't married, that sort of thing, just so that the appeal would still be there to the younger audience. But yeah, I don't recall playing much rock and roll in my life, and being referred to as a rock musician kind of makes me wince a little bit because gone to such trouble to not be a genre-based artist.
Right, right. People have to put you somewhere, so they're just trying to find a category.
Yeah, but it's just because people call all music rock music, even if it isn't. You know.
Right, right. So another one that caught my eye was building a reputation as a heavy guitar player is too much hassle.
Well, I used to be just really mental about the guitar when I was in my teens and when I first got in a band. And the world was starting to become more aware of the guitar as an instrument. Mm-hmm. And you were becoming more aware of who was playing the guitar. You know, you suddenly knew who Jeff Beck was and Eric Clapton was and a lot of other influences that I had. But these guys were making, you know, incredible progress with with an instrument that had kind of like stopped.
Right.
Had stopped progressing, and then they started, you know, messing with the sound of it, you know, and messing with other techniques and taking the basic blues foundations and refining them and adding more expressiveness to it in some cases, and other techniques that weren't necessarily common to a blues player. Jeff Beck especially is a guy who just has so many different technical approaches to the instrument, as well as, you know, his musical sensibility, just the kind of ways that he can play it and the sounds that he can coax out of it. So I was just possessed with the instrument and didn't think much about anything else. Mm-hmm. I realized that that's, first of all, it's a box you put yourself in. I put myself in that box just thinking, you know, I have to be one of those names. I have to be, you know, up there with Clapton and Jeff Beck and stuff like that. So you're striving for that, and then you realize at a certain point, maybe your devotion to the instrument is not of the same level as theirs. When I got into producing and songwriting and stuff like that, I realized that the guitar had a place in my musical life, but it wasn't the centerpiece of it. Mm-hmm. Especially when it came to writing, I just, you know, began to gravitate more towards the piano because of the flexibility of it. Guitar, you can only do 6 notes, and you can only do certain kinds of fingerings and inversions because of the physical limitations of the instrument. And piano, you've just got every note right out there in front of you. Just start putting your hands down like this. And then I realized also that sometimes less is more, and being the world's greatest guitar player is not as important as knowing what the right thing to play is at any particular time. So the guitar eventually, you know, had a different perspective. It's still the instrument I prefer to play live, just because I do so much singing, and I still like to shred on occasion. But if it's something more serious than that, you know, anything like finger picking or making the guitar sound like an organ or something like that, I leave it to my guitar player to do that. Right,
right. Speaking of, I'm curious, you've worked with such a huge range of amazing artists through the years. You have your band now that you're touring with. You did a recent tour with Utopia. You played with Ringo's All-Stars. So all these great musicians, I have to ask you, what do you look for when you're putting a band together for musicians to play with you?
Well, I haven't had to put a band together for like 25 years or something. I've been working with pretty much the same group of musicians. It's just that sometimes people retire from the road, and I've had to maybe replace a keyboard player a couple of times, but for the most part, it's still the same guys. You know, it's very helpful to have people who are familiar with your wider repertoire. So they've played on records that I've done in the late 80s, you know, that had big band sort of arrangements, through, you know, prog rock experimentations and bossa nova records and things like that. And the same group of musicians has kind of followed me through all those things. So if I have to revive some particular era, a song from a particular era, it's in there somewhere. We don't have to start from scratch again.
Right, right. So I have to ask, you've been on the cutting edge of technology on the computer side, the video side, the audio technology side. I remember around in the early 2000s, we interviewed you when I was editor at EQ magazine about the Bad Religion album with the modeled guitar amps being used and things. What do you see today as the state of applying technology to art?
We have survived the EDM fad, essentially music that on one hand, minimize the amount of human participation that was necessary, and maximize the amount of machine performance that's involved. But at the same time, it requires a certain level of understanding about the possibilities that the average person doesn't necessarily grasp. But, you know, it's moving a little bit away from that. It's still there. You hear EDM in every car commercial that's on. You know, it's appropriate to that. But technologically, it's changed. The technology has changed, and even in the past 10 years, to the point that I record differently than I used to. It would have been, even 10 years ago, difficult for me to do the kind of collaborative album that I did last year in White Knight, in which I was only in the studio with another person for one song, and everyone else was someplace else in the world that I collaborated with. And even 10 years ago, we didn't have these robust file sharing services like we have now, like Dropbox and the like. And so that makes it possible to move these really large files, and music files can be very large. It made it possible to move those around with relative ease. Right. Also the fact that everybody has much more access to the recording technology. For instance, I have become completely untethered from any kind of special hardware, except if a session calls for it. So I use Reason and my laptop, and I just finished mixing a 40-track live performance that Utopia did, and did not have to add any additional hardware in order to accomplish that. Right. And that was both surround elements and stereo mixes. So a lot more people have access to that sort of technology. Sure. So that you can pass things around in stem form, and they'll have whatever it is that they use. It doesn't have to be Reason, it can be something else. They can more easily open and manipulate the files and do whatever it is that they have to do, and then return it to me. I did a project that went on for 2.5 years like that before it came out with a couple of Norwegian musicians. So for me, the technology has, you know, dissolved those limitations and boundaries that required you to be in the same place. And I imagine that virtuality is going to sort of continue and develop further, so to the point that you can have these interactions in real time. You know, instead of just packing the files up and sending them, you open a stream to another musician, and or potentially more than one other musician in another place, and you could do record productions or collaborative performances or something like that, all in real time. Right. I'm hopeful that you can do that. You know, there are always latency problems and unexpected glitches in a system, and if you're trying to do a live performance, you can't have any of that stuff happening during the performance. So it's not like we're there yet, but it can be demonstrated. Right. And when it does get there, I imagine that I will figure out a way to use it.
I expect so, yeah.
Yeah.
So my last question for you is one that I always like to ask when I have an artist on your level here in the studio with me. you've worked with so many great artists through the years. You mentioned White Knight, where you had Donald Fagen and Trent Reznor and Joe Satriani, and an incredible list through the years that you've worked with. What is it that makes a great artist?
Well, it's not really a complicated thing. I've always said that, there's no excuse for waiting to create something. Like you need an ideal situation or somebody to give you an excuse to do it. And I've always said it, it's quite simple, an artist makes art.
Right.
If you're just sitting around calling yourself an artist, that's one thing. But, if you're an artist, you make art. If you're a writer, you write. If you're a dancer, you dance. The more you want to earn that particular title, the more you do the thing that title indicates.
Right.
So people are always approaching me and say, I'm waiting for my big break. How do I, what am I supposed to do? I can't get signed, blah, blah. It's like, just make your own music and put it online,
Right.
You can't wait to get signed, Go find any kind of gig that you can find and play in front of people, because that's the ultimate goal of getting people to listen to your music, firing them up to come out and see you live, which is where you get paid.
Right, right. And you made that jump early on with Patronet, where you were putting things out there and basically severing ties to the major label system back in the 90s and things, and looking forward to that.
Yeah, it was kind of a combination Facebook, GoFundMe thing, where you would build a community of people who would back you and get like first look privileges and things that perhaps the average person wouldn't care about, but that a fan would care about, as well as a place to meet other fans, socialize with them. That turned out to be the problem. The fan interactions sometimes got out of hand in the way that they do for Facebook now. Bullying and identity, funny business, people pretending to be me when it wasn't me, and security issues, all that stuff. I dealt with that in the 90s, and it just became too much of a distraction.
Right.
I was spending too much time worrying about that, not enough time making music, because a musician makes music.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. It was very forward thinking, though. You were way ahead of the curve on that one.
I've considered at some points, reviving it, because now people are used to the idea of getting their music online, and the material component has become much less important. So it's things have evolved around it that people would understand the concepts behind it. But I wouldn't do it the way that I did it before. I would need a lot of help.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure, right. Todd, thanks so much for taking time to sit down with
My
us. I know
pleasure.
you're on tour.
Thanks a lot.
Pleasure to have you here at Sweetwater, and good luck with the rest of the tour and Todd Stock and your 70th birthday celebrations and all the things that are going on this
Taking
year.
out the whole year for
That's
celebration.
Awesome. That is awesome. Well, we appreciate you being here.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks very much. And thank you for joining me for the Sweetwater Minute. I'm Mitch Gallagher.